Okay.
All right, so could you talk to me about why you came to America?
Okay, so my mother and her family are actually from Lithuania. And during the Second World War, um, everybody, because the war was being fought in Lithuania, many families wanted to leave there. And so my mother and her family tried to make the trip out of Lithuania. And they only got so far when my mother's oldest sister, who was very pregnant at the time, became afraid and they decided to go back. They were leaving Lithuania because they heard that in Germany, Hitler was providing people with food, jobs, and things were good there. And you know that that wasn't true, but that was the rumor. So when the rest of the family turned around and went back to Lithuania, my mother and her one sister decided to go forward. And at the time, my mother was about 18 years old, so she was very young and very courageous with her aunt. They went on foot, horse and buggy, and probably occasionally they would get a ride from somebody who had wheels. So when they got to Lithuania and my mother met who was going to be her husband, and she started having children, four of us were born in Germany. So there was me, my brother Augie, my other brother Rich, and my sister Regina, Gigi, as you know her. And that was just part of the trip. You know, the biggest part was getting to the United States, getting to America.
And what time did you leave to come to America?
Uh, let's see. I was born in Germany, and we landed in New Jersey at the dock in New Jersey when I was 6 years old. So we left. It was January of 1952 that we landed here in the United States, and I had a birthday on the ship. So my birthday is January 20th. So I know that it took us at least 2 weeks to cross the ocean, cross the Atlantic from Germany to the United States. One of the things that was happening at that time was that families that wanted to come over had to request passage. And as far as I remember, we waited about 2 years before we were given permission to come to the United States. And one of the things that was put in place at the time is you had to have a family that would sponsor you. So we spoke Lithuanian. My mother actually spoke several languages. She spoke some German, some Polish, some Russian, and of course Lithuanian. So we were sponsored by a Lithuanian family, and we lived with them for a while. And a part of that sponsorship was that that family had to find a job for my father, who was the head of the household, and then eventually we would find a place to live. We moved into a Lithuanian neighborhood, which is Bridgeport. I don't think it's that way anymore, but when we moved there, that's where we moved. And there were a lot of Lithuanian people, so we didn't feel lost because
And this was in Chicago, right?
this was in Chicago.
So how did you end up from docking in New Jersey to getting up into Chicago?
We took a train from New York. So from New Jersey, we went to New York. We had to be processed as immigrants, actually displaced people. We were called DPs, displaced person. And the displaced person was because we didn't at that point have a country. We didn't belong in Germany. We didn't belong in the United States yet. So we went through the process, and from New York, we took a train to Chicago. The reason that a lot of people travel to Chicago is because, again, there were jobs here in Chicago. So a lot of Lithuanians went to either Chicago or Cleveland, Canada, and some went to South America. And everybody traveled to those areas because of the promise of work and hopefully education.
So while you were kind of growing up as a child, was yourself getting a job difficult between like language barriers and kind of cultural differences, or was it easier?
Well, because I was 6 and my brothers and my sister were young, hanging out in the neighborhood, even though at the time that we came here, we spoke only Lithuanian, it was easy to learn English because kids learn other languages quickly. And so running around the neighborhood and going to our school, even though our school was run by the Sisters of St. Casimir, which is a Lithuanian order, we still spoke English. So once we mastered the language, getting a job for me was not difficult once I was able to work. My mother and my father worked in places like factories, and I think I told you this once before, that my mother learned how to speak English really by watching television. She would learn or listen to what they said and then also see what they were doing and put it together. And when my mom wrote something, she wrote it very phonetically. So she never learned how to spell the way we spell, but you always knew what she was writing when she wrote it down.
Yeah.
It was very phonetic. So for me, getting a job wasn't difficult. And I did become a citizen of the United States when I was 22 years old. I had your father and your aunt, and I thought it was important that I become a citizen just because we were going to live here, and I wanted to be a citizen of the United States. The other thing that we used to also do when we first came here, every January, by the end of the month, we had to fill out a card and drop it off at our local post office, indicating where we were living. We had a number. We had like an ID number, and I think it was called like a DP number. That stopped somewhere along the line, but I don't remember when. So we didn't have to do it anymore. But I remember filling out the card for everybody in the family and then walking it over to the post office in the neighborhood and dropping them off.
So I'm assuming that while you lived in Bridgeport, you received grade school, middle school, and high school. After that, what types of formal education did you have, such as college?
So yes, we went to school in Bridgeport. We went to St. George's grade school. Because of our family circumstances, we were moved from Bridgeport. We moved to the north side. My brothers, my sister, and I were placed in a home because there was a lot of strife and struggle in the family. Once we left there, Regina and I left there when she was in about 5th grade and I was in about my freshman year of high school. And again, we lived now in Brighton Park, which at that time was also primarily Lithuanian, but also some Polish, but still Eastern European kind of people. And I went to Maria High School. I graduated from there, and I got married right away, which was not that unusual for that time, and then had my children. I went back to school when my kids were older. I can't remember exactly, but I decided to go to school, and it took me 8 years to get my undergraduate degree at St. Xavier, and then I went for 4 more years at Loyola to get my master's in social work. Education was always held in very high standards among the Lithuanian community, and I think that things, even for our family, might have been different in terms of attaining higher education, maybe getting different kind of work if our family didn't have the kinds of struggles that we had, mostly with alcoholism.
While you grew up and while you went to school, were there any sort of cultural barriers in either Bridgeport or Brighton Park, sort of like with other kids, maybe other ethnicities?
The only thing that I recall is when we lived in Bridgeport. Now, we were young. There were some folks that lived on the same block that we did that used to make fun of us. They used to call us dumb DPs. And I had crossed eyes, and they used to call me cross-eyed dumb DP. And once, I recall that this may have happened more than once, but the only thing I remember is someone threw dirt into my brother's buggy. My brother Ray was just an infant at the time, and I'm not sure what other than the fact that we were immigrants, I'm not sure what else they didn't like about us, but yeah, they taunted us. And a lot of the kids at the time would walk around together. The Lithuanian kids would walk around together in groups of threes and fours, so that if they were bullied by somebody, they at least had each other. And they would fight back, I guess. I never was involved in any of that kind of struggle, but that kind of stuff did happen.
Okay. And then so after that, everything kind of like worked out with your education and you raising your family?
You know, over time, my first marriage didn't last either, but with education, with time, my mother was able to either rent buildings or purchase a building. She always had the idea that if she had a business, and she owned a couple of taverns, if she had a business and an apartment in the back, we could all live together and she could still make a living. And so over time, things became easier. I think some of the major barriers to my parents when we came here was the language. They didn't speak English, so they counted on and relied on other people, mostly other Lithuanians, to help them either get a job and eventually